She didn't shake Mirabel Osei-Darko's hand. Not because she missed it. Not because she was distracted. She looked right at it. That outstretched hand, steady and unhurried. And she turned away, picked up her pen, started flipping through papers that didn't need flipping. And Mirabel stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pulled her hand back, smoothed the front of her jacket, and sat down at the conference table like nothing had happened. Because for her, nothing had. That's the thing about people who've built something real. They don't need the room to validate them. They already know what they walked in with. But the woman at the head of that table, Vivienne Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Renner Capital, one of the oldest private equity firms in Toronto, didn't know that yet. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Either way, she was about to learn something that $200 million tends to teach very efficiently. Before any of that, though, before the boardroom, before the snub, before everything that followed, there was a Tuesday morning in Scarborough. And a kitchen table with a wobbly leg. A girl with a school bag that was one zipper pull away from falling apart completely. Mirabel's mother, a nurse named Dorcas, had a habit of rising at 4:45 every morning. Not because her shift started early, though it often did, but because she believed, genuinely and without irony, that the first hour of the day belonged to the people who were willing to show up for it. She'd make tea. She'd sit in the quiet. She'd think. Mirabel grew up watching that. She grew up understanding that discipline wasn't punishment. It was just the price of not being surprised by your own life. Her father, Eugene, drove a cab. He drove it 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for almost 19 years. He knew every street in Toronto the way other people know their own backyards. He could tell you which intersections flooded in March, which shortcuts clogged at 5:20 on Fridays, which neighborhoods tipped, and which ones didn't. He kept a notebook in the glove compartment, not for addresses, but for ideas. Things he noticed, patterns he saw. He never did anything with those notebooks, but Mirabel did. She studied economics at U of T, not because it was prestigious, though it was. Because it made sense to her. The way money moved, the way capital accumulated and dispersed, the logic beneath markets. It felt like a language she'd been trying to learn her whole life without knowing that's what she was doing. She graduated with distinction, got a junior analyst position at a mid-size firm downtown, wore the same 2 blazers for 3 years, and nobody ever noticed because she made sure they were never seen back to back. She learned the work. She did more of it than anyone asked. She stayed late not to impress anyone, but because she genuinely wanted to understand things fully before she stopped for the day. By 31, she had her first fund. Small, $11 million. Family money, a few community investors, 2 people who'd also known her father. She ran it conservatively, transparently, and well. By 37, she had $38 million under management. By 42, she had cleared $160 million, with another 42 committed, and in process. She drove a 7-year-old Volvo. She got her hair done at the same salon in Lawrence Heights she'd been going to since she was 24. She wore good clothes, not flashy, just good, the kind of quality that takes a while to notice, which was exactly the point. She was, in every observable sense, a woman who had made it. Not because she wanted anyone to see that she'd made it. Because she wanted to keep building. Which is what brought her to the Caldwell morning in 2022. The meeting had been arranged through proper channels. 6 weeks of emails, 2 rounds of preliminary calls, a formal proposal submitted through Caldwell Renner's investor relations process. Mirabel's firm, Osei Capital Partners, based in North York, had been identified as a strong candidate for a co-investment partnership. The deal on the table was a significant one, a combined stake in a mixed-use development in Mississauga. The kind of project that required serious capital and serious partners. Mirabel had done her due diligence. She knew Caldwell Renner's track record. She knew their portfolio. She knew their reputation, which was solid in the financial press, and somewhat more complicated in private conversations among Black and South Asian fund managers who'd tried to work with them before. She'd noted that, filed it under things to watch rather than reasons to walk away. She believed in giving people the opportunity to be better than their reputation. She arrived at the building on Bay Street 11 minutes early. Liu, She checked in at reception, waited in a lobby that was beautiful in the specific way expensive lobbies are. Marble, understated art, the particular hush of money at rest. A receptionist, a young man named Patrick Stowe, according to his lanyard, led her up in a private elevator to the 14th floor. He made small talk on the way up. He seemed genuinely pleasant. The boardroom was long. Glass on two sides. Lake Ontario visible on a clear day, though that morning the sky was the color of old concrete. There were 6 people already seated when Mirabel walked in. 6 people in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Looking at their phones or their papers, doing the subtle recalibration that people in rooms like that do when someone new enters. Mirabel knew 2 of them by name from her research. She recognized a third from a charity gala she'd attended the previous spring. Vivian Caldwell was at the head of the table. Mirabel had seen photographs, of course. Vivian was 61, silver-haired, known in financial circles for a particular brand of directness that some described as decisive and others described as something less flattering. She'd built Caldwell Renner into a firm with over $2 billion in assets under management. She'd done it during periods when very few women were doing anything of the sort. Mirabel respected that, genuinely. She walked toward the head of the table, extended her hand. Mirabel Osei-Darko, OC Capital, Partners. It's a pleasure to finally. Vivian glanced up, took in Mirabel's hand. Her face didn't shift into hostility. It didn't shift into anything. She simply looked back down at her papers and said, to no one in particular, we should get started. I have a 2 o'clock. The room went very quiet in a specific way. Not the hush of focused attention, the hush of who've just seen something they're not sure how to respond to and have collectively decided not to. Mirabel's hand stayed out for perhaps 2 more seconds. Then she withdrew it, smoothly, without comment. She took the chair she'd been gestured to, midway down the left side of the table, and she set her folder in front of her. A brown leather folder she'd had since her 2nd year running the fund. It was worn at the corners. It held inside it a proposal that represented 14 months of careful thinking. Nobody offered her coffee, though there was coffee at the sideboard. She didn't ask for any. The meeting started. A man named Gordon Holt, managing director, as his nameplate said, walked through the project overview. Mirabel listened. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both demonstrating a level of due diligence that made one of the younger analysts across the table blink and look up from his notes. Then Vivian spoke. Miss Osei, not Osei-Darko. Just Osei, dropped like a file name. Walk us through your liquidity position. Mirabel did, clearly, without hedging. And your fund's history, you've been operating, what, 5 years? 12, Mirabel said. We launched in 2010. A pause. 12. Vivian said it like she was correcting a math error in her head. And your total AUM currently, 162 million, with 42 committed and in process. Something shifted at the table. Small. But Mirabel had been in enough rooms to feel it. One of the other partners, a man named Terrence Wall, leaned forward slightly and said, that's a strong position for a firm your size. Vivienne didn't react to this. She moved to the next item on her agenda. And then, this is the part that people who heard about this later found hardest to believe. She said, casually, like she was commenting on the weather, I do want to make sure we're aligned on expectations. We typically work with partners who've been through the cycle a few times. This kind of deal requires a certain track record of judgment. There was a way she said it. The pause before track record. The look she gave the room rather than Mirabel when she said it. The way she phrased it as a general principle while directing it very specifically. Mirabel said, I'd be happy to walk you through the decisions we made during 2020 and how the fund performed relative to benchmark. That won't be necessary, Vivian said, and moved on. Afterward, in the elevator going down, Patrick Stowe asked if she needed validation for parking. She said yes. He printed it, handed it over, started to say something, then stopped. She looked at him. He seemed embarrassed by something that wasn't his fault. Have a good day, she said, and she meant it. She drove back to office in North York and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in. Not because she was upset, though she was, because she wanted to think clearly before she did anything. There are two kinds of disrespect in a room like that. The kind that comes from ignorance, people who genuinely don't see what they're doing. And the kind that comes from choice, people who know exactly what they're doing and do it anyway because they've never had a reason to stop. Vivian Caldwell had not been ignorant. She was 61 years old. She had been in business for 4 decades. She had seen enough of the world to know what she was communicating when she looked at a woman's outstretched hand and turned away from it. That was the part Mirabel kept coming back to, not the snub itself. She'd had worse hits, but the certainty with which it had been delivered, the absence of discomfort, the sense that Vivian had simply done what she always did, and nothing in her experience had ever made her feel the need to do otherwise. That evening, she called her lawyer, a woman named Adaeze Okonkwo, who had offices in Yorkville and a reputation that made people's assistants very polite on the phone. She told Adaeze what had happened. Not with drama, just the facts. Adaeze listened. Then she said, "Do you want to pursue the deal through other means, or are you done with Caldwell Renner?" Mirabel thought about it, actually thought about it, which is not the same as having already decided and performing deliberation. "I'm done," she said, "but I want to do it properly." She sent the withdrawal letter the following morning, formal, professional, without explanation of cause. In financial circles, that kind of letter contains its own message. The absence of a reason is, in itself, a reason. People who know how these things work understand that. The letter went to Gordon Holt as the managing director, with a copy to Vivian. It stated that OC Capital Partners from the proposed co-investment arrangement, effective immediately. It thanked Caldwell Renner for their time. That was it. For a few days, nothing. Then Gordon Holt called, left a message. He was professional, slightly strained if there was a way to address OC Capital's concerns. Mirabel's assistant, a man named Rowan Giles, returned the call and conveyed that Ms. Osei-Darko had decided to redirect the capital commitment and was not seeking further dialogue on the matter. A week later, the calls stopped. What happened next didn't happen because of Mirabel. Or rather, it didn't happen only because of Mirabel. It happened because she wasn't the first. Word moves differently in investment circles than it does elsewhere. It doesn't travel through social media or news articles, not at first. It travels through conversations between people who all know each other, which means it travels fast, and it travels with context. 2 weeks after Mirabel's withdrawal, over lunch at a restaurant in the Distillery District, she mentioned what had happened to a colleague named Marcus Allen, who managed a fund out of Montreal. Marcus had his own history with Caldwell Renner. Nothing as direct as what Mirabel had experienced, but enough that he recognized the pattern immediately. He mentioned it to someone else. That someone mentioned it to a woman named Paulette Sears, who ran a wealth management boutique in Vancouver and had been considering a separate deal with Caldwell Renner. Paulette made a phone call to Mirabel directly. She introduced herself. She said, "I heard something. I'd like to understand it better, if you're willing." Mirabel was willing. That call lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, Paulette had decided to delay her own due diligence on the Caldwell Renner deal, pending further information. 2 of her institutional contacts, when she passed on what she'd learned, carefully, professionally, with no embellishment, made similar decisions. The Mississauga development needed a third co-investor to close. The deal was structured such that without that capital commitment, the other parties couldn't proceed on the terms they'd negotiated. It was a pressure point in the architecture of the deal that everyone involved had known about going in. But nobody at Caldwell Renner had imagined that the third co-investor, the one they'd been courting for 6 weeks, the one they'd allocated a seat in the middle of their boardroom table, too, would simply withdraw. And certainly nobody had imagined that the withdrawal would cause a ripple that reached 2 other prospective partners. By December, the co-investment arrangement had collapsed. In January, Vivian Caldwell sent a letter. It came through proper channels. Formal letterhead, addressed to Mirabel directly. Mirabel's assistant flagged it as significant, and she read it the same afternoon it arrived. It was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that there had been a previous meeting. The second expressed, in language that had been very carefully chosen by someone, probably a lawyer, that Vivian regretted any impression that may have arisen that did not reflect the firm's values or her own. The third expressed a hope that there might be an opportunity in the future to explore a more productive working relationship. There was no acknowledgement of what had actually happened, no naming of the specific moment, no apology in any real sense of the word, just the careful buffered language of someone who understood that something had gone wrong and wanted it to go less wrong without having to say exactly what it was. Mirabel read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk and looked out the window at the January sky over North York. Gray, flat, the kind of cold that sits in the glass. She thought about her mother getting up at 4:45. She thought about her father's notebook in the glove compartment, full of patterns no one ever asked him about. She thought about the 3 seconds she'd stood with her hand out, in front of 6 people, and how none of those 6 people had said a word. She picked up a pen, and she wrote back. 1 paragraph. It said that she appreciated receiving the letter, and wished Caldwell Renner well in their future endeavors. Nothing more. No door left open, no invitation to follow up. Clean and final, the way good decisions usually are. The Mississauga deal eventually went forward. 18 months later, with a different structure and a different third party. Caldwell Renner's role in it was diminished from what they'd originally negotiated. The market had moved. The terms weren't as favorable. The project still got built, but the returns that had looked certain in 2022 looked considerably less certain. By the time everything closed, meanwhile, OC Capital Partners redirected the committed capital into 2 separate opportunities. One in Calgary, one in Hamilton. Both performed well. By 2024, Mirabel's AUM had crossed $215 million. She didn't announce this. There was no press release. People in the industry noticed, because that's what people in the industry do. They pay attention to who is moving capital and where. The woman who'd attended that October meeting in 2022, the one sitting in the middle of the table, started getting phone calls from people she'd never spoken to before. People who'd heard her name, people who knew someone who knew someone. The right kind of attention earned the right kind of way. There's a thing that happens, sometimes, in rooms like that boardroom on Bay Street, a kind of blindness that grows from too much certainty. It makes people look at someone and see only what they expect to see. And what they expect is shaped by things that have nothing to do with that person's actual life. Their actual numbers, their actual history. Vivian Caldwell looked at Mirabel Osei-Darko and saw someone who needed something from her. That was the mistake. Not a small one. Because Mirabel had walked in with $200 million worth of capital, a 12-year track record, and the kind of discipline that comes from watching your mother make tea at 4:45 in the morning for 30 years. She didn't need Vivian's approval. She'd come offering a partnership. There's a difference. When it was withdrawn, quietly, without drama, without a scene, the absence of that capital turned out to matter far more than anyone in that room had anticipated. Because Mirabel wasn't just a fund manager. She was, as it turned out, connected to a network of people who paid attention to how their colleagues were treated. People who made their own calculations accordingly. None of them said anything publicly. They didn't need to. The deal collapsed on its own weight once the right piece was removed. Terrence Wall, the managing director, who'd nodded when Mirabel mentioned her AUM. He left Caldwell Renner in the spring of 2023. He joined a smaller firm, which suited him better. He was later quoted in a trade publication, in a profile about changes in the private equity landscape, saying that the industry needed to be more honest about the informal networks and biases that shaped who got invited to the table and who got treated as if they belonged out there once they arrived. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Patrick Stowe, the young man from reception, moved to a different firm by summer. He sometimes thought about that Tuesday morning. He thought about how he'd started to say something to Mirabel in the elevator going down and then stopped. He wasn't sure, even now, what he would have said. He just knew he should have said something. Vivian Caldwell remained CEO of Caldwell Renner. The firm continued. These things rarely end cleanly. But the deal they'd been structured around didn't close the way they'd planned, the quarter they'd planned it, at the returns they'd modeled. And the reasons why, when people who understood the sector talked about it privately, traced back, always, to that October meeting, to a hand extended across a conference table, to a woman who looked at it and turned away. Mirabel still drives the Volvo. It's 9 years old now, and she has no plans to change it. She still gets her hair done at the same salon in Lawrence Heights. She added a third analyst to her team in 2023. She's thinking about opening a Calgary office. She kept the worn leather folder. It's still in use. Some people who know the full story have asked her, at different points, whether she was angry, whether she wanted something more. Some public reckoning, some formal acknowledgement, something on the record. She thinks about that question. She gives it the weight it deserves. She gives it the mother used to say, usually over tea in the early morning before the rest of the house was awake, that you can't spend your energy waiting for someone else to understand the cost of what they did. You can only make sure you never forget it yourself. That's not bitterness. That's something different, something longer lasting and more useful. She closed her folder. She kept building. And the handshake she never received turned out to be the most expensive gesture in that room. Not for her, but for the woman who withheld it.